Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kuf Nun Hey contains two Mishnayos, and therefore it's divided into three parts. The first part is a conclusion of the discussion about using the sides of a tree or other growing object. Then we get to a Mishnah which discusses placing food in front of an animal. The Mishnah is going to use several terms which we aren't familiar with, and the Gemara will have a lengthy machlokes trying to figure out what the terms mean and how that affects the halacha. The next Mishnah talks about actually feeding animals, possibly force feeding them, and again there are terms that aren't clear, and we're going to have a lengthy discussion figuring them out. At the end of the daf, we'll discuss the halachos of lush, which is mixing powders with liquids in order to create a dough of sorts, and the Gemara will briefly discuss that. That's much more of a discussion for the next step. So first of all, the Gemara is coming off a statement by Rava. Rava had said that you're allowed to use tzidei studin and studin of a tree, or you're not allowed to use either. Meaning there are two opinions. You're either allowed to use the sides of a tree and the sides of the sides, or you're not allowed to use not the sides and not the sides of the sides. There is no split that the studin you're not allowed to use and the tzidei studin you are. Now what are these things? So studin, the size of the tree, means something stuck on the tree. So if there is a peg stuck into a tree and you hang something on the peg, that's called you are using the size of the tree, that's studin. Now if however there's a basket hanging from that peg, so the peg is studin, the basket is tzidei studin, by you placing something in the basket, or you standing in the basket, or whatever it is, that would be called using tzidei studin. According to Rava, there's no difference between the two, and now the Gemara is going to try to prove that there is a difference. And the Gemara quotes a brisa which has the following halacha: if somebody has a basket hanging on a peg stuck in a tree, he doesn't have to worry about the halacha of not using the sides of a tree. He does have a different issue. The case here is where he wants to set up an erev tchumen. That means he wants to set food aside so that he will be able to reach it for Shabbos. That should extend his tchum. In order for it to work, he has to be able to get to the food on Shabbos. Now, if the basket is 4 tvachim wide and 10 tvachim suspended above the ground, it's a rishus hayachid, and you wouldn't be able to get to it from the rishus harabim. Therefore, if it's above 10 tvachim, it's a problem. If it's below 10 tvachim, it's not a problem because it's in the same rishus that you are in. So that's what the Mishnah says, the Brisa says, but it clearly makes no issue out of the fact that you're using the side of a tree. Obviously, as long as the basket is hanging on a peg, it's okay, because that's tzidei studin, but it's got to be a basket hanging on a peg. If it will be just the food placed directly on the peg, or if it will be a basket hanging from a tree without a peg, so that would be just studin, and that would be forbidden. So you see clearly that there is at least one opinion that says that studin is forbidden, and tzidei studin is permitted. So the Rav Papa answers for Rava, and he says, no, here are the cases where the basket is a very narrow, small opening, and if you stick your hand into it, you have to worm your hand in, and it shakes the entire situation, and therefore it's considered like tzedadin. The tzidei tzedadin themselves is considered like tzedadin themselves. The basket, it's very much using and shaking whatever it's connected to. So if it's connected directly to the tree, it's forbidden. If it's connected to a peg hanging from the tree, then it's permitted. The reason is because this opinion is really holding that studin and tzidei studin are both permitted. The thing is, because you have to force your hand into the basket, it's not considered like you're using the basket. It's considered like you're using the thing that the basket is on. Therefore, studin and tzidei studin here are both permitted, and this is a case of studin. If you would have the basket tied directly to the tree, you'd be using the tree itself, not that studin, not the sides of the tree. Okay, now the Gemara says that the halacha in this entire discussion is as follows. The halacha is that studin is forbidden and tzidei studin is permitted. And Rashi says, now that we have that halacha, if you want to climb up to a high clubhouse or something, you have to be careful not to rest your ladder against the tree itself, because the ladder is studin, and by you standing on it, you're using studin, and that's forbidden. So you either rest the ladder on something else or on a bar connected to the tree. That way the ladder is tzidei studin, and make sure that your feet step only on the ladder and not on the bar connected to the tree, because again that would be called using tzedadin. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses the halachos about preparing food for animals to eat on Shabbos. There are two fairly distinct halves to the Mishnah. The first half is complex, and the reason is because we don't know what some of the terms here mean. It discusses 3 types of food and 2 types of activities to prepare them. The 3 types of food are called pikiyei amir, that we know means the stalks of grain. And then there's kipin and zirin. One of them is also the stalks of grain, just with an extra rope holding the bundle together. And the other one is branches of a cedar tree, soft, fresh cedar branches. Again, the Gemara will have a machlokas about which is which. The two activities is unwrapping the bundles, sliding off the rope so that it's open. That's called matirin. And then the other activity is called mefasfasin, which Rashi defines as spreading them so that the animal is tempted to eat them, and the Aruch defines as cracking them up so that they're more edible. Either way, matirin, untying, is the basic activity. Cracking them up or spreading them is a more involved activity, which you do not necessarily have to do. Now, the Gemara clearly says as follows. It says that you're allowed to untie the peki. You're allowed to untie the stalks. As far as spreading them or cracking them, so it's not clear what the Mishnah says about peki, whether you're allowed to do that for that. That's going to be a machlokes. But it does clearly say that you are allowed to spread the kipin, and you're not allowed to spread the zirin. And again, the Gemara will explain how this makes sense. The second half of the Mishnah discusses crushing plants. You have hay and chruv, carob. So it's a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda about the chruv. The hay you clearly are allowed to crush, whether it's for a large animal like a cow or a small animal like a goat or a sheep, a gasa or a daka. The chruv is mechlokes. The Tanakama says you're not allowed to crush it, and Rabbi Yehuda says crushing chruv for a thin animal, small animal, a behema daka, that is permitted. Okay, now the Gemara begins, and the Gemara wants to figure out what is peki, kifin, and zirin. And are you allowed to do mafasfasin? Are you allowed to spread them and crunkle them or not? So the Gemara has machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda, and the machlokes is a halachic machlokes, and each one understands the Mishnah based on how he understands the halacha. There are two activities here. One is is making food, taking something which is not food and putting it in a food state. So the branches of a cedar tree are definitely not food until you spread them or break them up. So mefasfasin, the branches, whether it's zirin or kipin, is part of the machlokas. That is turning non-food into food. According to Rav Huna, that is forbidden. You're not allowed to create food on Shabbos. That's an Isra of Neilad. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's the only thing that's permitted because the animal needs food and you have to be able to feed it. Now the other activity is doing extra work on something which is already food and making it more tempting for the animal. That would be spreading or cracking something which already is food. According to Rav Huna, that's permitted because it's food already. So you're not creating anything. According to Rav Yehuda, that's forbidden. That the animal doesn't need. It could deal with the food on its own. As long as it's food, it's okay. So in some of the machlokes is, what are you allowed to do? Are you allowed to deal with something which is already food and make it better? That's what Rav Huna holds. Or are you only allowed to make non-food into food? That's what Rabbi Yehuda holds. Now, how do we understand the Mishnah based on this machlokes? So it's as follows. According to Rav Huna, zirin is the branches. And zirin, you're not allowed to crackle them up. You're not allowed to spread them or break them up. That's what the Mishnah says. The only thing you're not allowed to do is mefasfasin for zirin. And the reason is because the branches are not food, and by breaking them up, you're going to make them into food. Kipin and bekiyin are both hay, and you're allowed to untie them, and you're allowed to spread them out, because that's already food. It's food all along. It's not a problem. Now, according to Yehuda, you're only allowed to make non-food into food. You're not allowed to work hard to make the food more tempting. Therefore, the Mishnah is saying the following thing. It's saying peki, which is not food until you open up the ties. You're allowed to open it up. Once it's open, to go ahead and spread it out or crackle it up, that you're not allowed to do. That's extra work. Zirin is also peki, and therefore you're also allowed to untie it, but you're not allowed to do mefasfin. You're not allowed to spread it or crackle it up. The cedar branches, that's the kipin. The kipin is not food until you crackle it up. So those branches you are allowed to do mefasfin. You're allowed to spread them, break them up, however you understand it. So that's the machlokas here. And now, again, what we need to focus on basically is, are you allowed to work and prepare food which is already food, or you're only allowed to make non-food into food? That's Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. So the Gemara tries to bring 4 proofs to this machlokas. The first one is from our Mishnah itself, and that's if you look further in the Mishnah, the Gemara says that you're not allowed to grind up, you're not allowed to crush the hay and the chruv. So, carob. So the Gemara says that the simple shot would be that you understand that this is talking about soft things. Hay is soft, so it's probably referring to fresh carob, which is also soft, and it's saying that you're not allowed to grind it up. So you see clearly that you're not allowed to work with something which is already food. Right? They're soft, they're already food, and you're not allowed to grind them up further. So it's clear indication that you're not allowed to work with something which is food already, which is the opinion of Yehuda. That's the kasha on Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, no. It's not that it's hay which is similar to carob. It's not that it's carob which is similar to hay and they're both soft. It's hay which is similar to carob and they're both hard. We're talking about where they're both hard. And the reason that you're not allowed to do it is because you're making it into food. If it would be food already, you'd be allowed to deal with it. The Gemara says, how do you have hay which is hard? Hay is not hard. The Gemara says, yeah, if you're feeding a very young donkey, so it's hard for him to eat regular hay, you have to break it up, and therefore you're making something which is not food into food, and that's why this is forbidden. Okay, next proof. The Gemara says, if you look at the machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda about the churov, the Tanna Kama had said that it is forbidden to break up churov for any size animal, and Rabbi Yehuda said no, churov is permitted for a behema dataka, for a thin, small animal like a sheep or a goat. So the Gemara says, how do you understand this machlokes over here? If the discussion is like Rabbi Yehuda the Amir explained it, that you are allowed to make non-food items into food, so then I understand. The argument is churov considered to be food or not? The Tanna Kama holds that churov is already food, and therefore you're not allowed to deal with it. And along comes Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, no, for a behema daka, for a small animal, it's not food yet, and it's not edible, therefore you're allowed to break it up so that he could eat it. That makes sense. However, if you hold like Rav Huna, and the only things that you're allowed to deal with and work with are things which are food already, so then the Tanna Kama holds you're not allowed to deal with these things because they're not food. Rav Yehuda argues and he says you are allowed to deal with them because they are food already. So why is he saying that for a small animal it's food? If it's food for a small animal, it's definitely edible for a big animal. If it's food for the daka, it's certainly food for the gasa. So why is he saying only for the gasa? It doesn't make sense. So Gemara says, no, you're right. Over here, Rav Yehuda's halacha applies to the small animal and the big animal. When he said behema daka, he did not mean a small animal. Behema daka is referring to a big animal who grinds his food dak. He knows how to chew very well. That's what daka means here. You thought it meant small animal, not what it means. It means an animal who chews well. So Gemara says that can't be, because the term daka in gasa is used earlier in the Mishnah, and it clearly means daka as opposed to gasa. So don't tell me that's the same thing, and that daka means he chews the food well. The Gemara grants that point. The Gemara says kasha. Okay, now the Gemara has another proof. This is from a Mishnah coming up in the next daf, and it's very similar to our first proof. The Mishnah says you're allowed to cut up pumpkins for animals and carcasses to feed to the dogs. So the Gemara says, so we're comparing pumpkins and carcasses. Most probably it means that the pumpkins are soft, like the carcasses are, and therefore you're only allowed to do it because it's food, because it's already soft. But if it would be hardy, turning it into food, you wouldn't be allowed to, and that's a proof to Rav Huna. So Gemara says, no, it's the other way. It's talking about carcasses which are similar to pumpkins, both are hard, and you're only allowed to do it because you're turning it into food, like Rav Huna. So like Rav Yehuda. So the Gemara says, well, how do you have a situation where carcass is hard? And the Gemara says either it's elephant carcass, or it's talking about you're giving it to small dogs too young to chew. Okay, the Gemara's fourth proof is a brisa of Rav Chanan of Naharda, who says that you're allowed to break up straw and hay and mix them together. So you see, you're allowed to break them up and mix them together. This is all food. So obviously you're allowed to deal with food. You're allowed to work with food. This is like the opinion of Rav Huna. The Gemara says, no, it's talking about straw, which is a little rotten, so it's not food until you deal with it. And it's talking about hay, which is for very small donkeys, and therefore it's hard for them to eat until you crack it up. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses actually feeding animals. And we're going to actually discuss force feeding the animal, which means forcing a large amount of food into the animal's mouth. The Mishnah has two halves. Again, we'll focus on the first half. And it talks about force feeding three types of creatures: a camel, a calf, and a chickens. And it uses four terms. So for a camel, we have the term oivsin and Dorsin. The Mishnah says they're both permitted. Oivsin is really force feeding a lot, so that you're almost feeding an entire food crib. Dorsin is forcing less food down. They're both permitted on Shabbos. For a calf, you have mamirin and malitin. Now, malitin is also a term that applies to camels. So mamirin is permitted, malitin is forbidden, both for calves and camels. So far we have oivsin, dorsin, and mamirin, which are all permitted, and malitin, which is forbidden. The Gemara will define the terms mamirin and malitin. Then for chickens, we have mehalkitin. Mehalkitin is permitted, and malitin for chickens is also permitted. Okay, so mahalkitin and malitin are permitted. Oivsin, dorsin, mamirin are forbidden. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the halacha of giving food to wild birds. The Gemara first of all says if you have bran, you're allowed to put in water, but you're not allowed to mix them. That would be lush. And to actually put out water for bees or for pigeons in your own private pigeon coop, that is forbidden. But you are allowed to put it out for geese, chickens, or domesticated pigeons. Okay, so the Gemara will explain why that would be permitted and what the issue is over there. So first of all, the Gemara wants to define what these terms are. The Gemara says, what is oivsin? Rav Yehuda says it means that you feed it so much that its stomach blows up to be the size of an actual food crib. The Gemara asks, is that possible? And Rav Yirmiyah says, yes. I saw a Arab merchant who was leading his camels, and he forced as much food down its throat as an entire core, which is a corn crib full, and it actually was carrying the same amount on its back itself. Okay, next we had said that mamirin is forbidden and malitin is permitted. The singular is hamra and halata. So the Gemara wants to know what is the difference between these things and why is one of them permitted and one forbidden. So it's a machlekes of Yehuda and of Chizah. According to Yehuda, that which is forbidden is to stuff the food so far down its throat that it cannot cough it up if it wants to. What's permitted is to force it into its mouth, but it can spit it out. Rav Chizah says no, that's not correct. Both these cases are talking about where you force it to the place where it can't return it. What's forbidden is to use a kli, an object, to force it down. You're only allowed to use your hand, but if you use your hand, you're allowed to force it that far down. Okay, the Gemara says, let's try to prove one of these two opinions. Forbidden and permitted depends on how far you push it, or it depends on what you're using to push it. So in order to figure this out, Rav Yosef quotes a brisa which talks about force feeding chickens and pigeons, and it uses the terms mahalkitin and malaktin, two terms, and it says both of them are permitted for chickens and forbidden for pigeons. So the Gemara says, what would be the reason for this? What's the difference between malaktin and mahalkitin? So the Gemara says, okay, let's try to figure out what's the difference between mahalkitin and malaktin. Both of them are forbidden for pigeons and permitted for chickens. So if one of them means force feeding it, and one of them means just placing food in front of it, so that doesn't make sense, because why would it be forbidden to place food in front of a pigeon? There's no logic to that. So the Gemara says it must mean that one of them is pushing the food so deep that the chicken or the bird can't cough it up, and one of them is pushing it not so deep and it is able to cough it up. Now, this brisa says that both of these are permitted for chickens. And therefore, back in our Mishnah, when it said that one thing is forbidden and one thing is permitted, obviously the thing that's forbidden has got nothing to do with how far you push the food, because here we're saying that no matter how far you push the food, it's permitted. And yet our Mishnah had a version which is forbidden. That must mean that what's forbidden, that's got to be where you're using a tool. And here where we're saying that it makes no difference how far you push it, that is true. The only problem is if you use a kli, if you use a tool. And there's no difference between birds and animals. The only difference between birds and animals is what the term is called. But either way, the halacha should be the same. The thing which is forbidden is with a kli, and things which is permitted is with the hand. And it's a proof to Rav Chizda. So Yehuda answers and he says, no. This entire calculation is built upon the fact that you had a problem with why you should be not allowed to put food down in front of a pigeon. Really, I'm going to tell you there's a reason you can't put food down in front of a pigeon. And therefore the difference between mahalkatin and malaktin is one is feeding it gently with your hand, not forcing anything, and the other one is just putting food in front of it. Both are permitted for chickens, both are forbidden for pigeons, and the reason is that you have no business feeding wild pigeons. They're not your problem. It's not your responsibility to feed them, and therefore you're not allowed to feed them. And we even have a brisa which shows that this halacha is true. It says you're allowed to put food in front of a dog, but you're not allowed to put food in front of a wild hog. What's the difference? Dogs that are yours, you're responsible to feed. Wild pigs have plenty of food. They don't need you to feed them, and you have no business feeding animals that are not your responsibility to feed. Says Rav Ashi, if you look at our Mishnah, that seems to be true as well. Our Mishnah said that you're not allowed to give water to bees and pigeons. But you are allowed to give water to geese, chickens, and domesticated pigeons. What's the difference? Obviously, the bees and the wild pigeons are not your responsibility to feed or to give water, and therefore you're not allowed to give it. The ones which are, the geese, the chickens, and the home pigeons, those you are allowed to. So again, we see this rule that an animal which is not your responsibility to feed or to water, you're not allowed to feed or to water. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. If this is true, so why are we talking about watering? You should be allowed to give them grain. If they're yours, you're allowed to give them grain. If they're not yours, you're not allowed to give them grain. So Gemara says, no, the problem is the watering, because there's plenty of water available for them. Grain, you'll be allowed to feed them even if they're not your responsibility to feed, because it's hard for them to find grain. Water, there's water out there in plenty. There's water all over the place. Therefore, you have no right to give them water. Okay, now Rabbi Yoina, not Yoina the bird, but Rabbi Yoina, standing at the door of Bein Nesiya, said the following drasha. What does it mean? The pasuk in Mishlei Tzadik, Yedei Tzadik Din Dalim, the righteous one knows the judgment of the poor. It's referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who knows the judgment of the dog. Understands that the dog has a hard time finding food, just like we said that it's hard that you can feed the dog because it's hard for him to find food. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes that the dog's food stays in his stomach and is not digested until 3 days after eating. However, birds and other creatures are not like that. The Gemara says, where do we see this halacha? Where is this relevant halachically? If a creature eats flesh of a dead human, so as long as the creature is alive, there is no tumas oil because the tumah is inside his body and it's locked in. However, once the creature has died, then the flesh which is in his stomach is no longer locked in, and its tumah could be matame everything in the room as long as it still exists. If it's fully digested and broken down, then it's not an issue anymore. So we have to know how long it takes for that flesh that's in the animal's stomach to be digested, so that if the animal were to die in a room, within that time the flesh is still there, it's not digested yet, it's matame everything in the room. So what's the time? So for a dog it says it's 72 hours, because the dog's food keeps for a long time. However, for birds and fish, it goes as quickly as long as if that flesh would have fallen into a fire and burned up. That's how fast it gets digested in their intestines. Okay, now says Rav Hamnuni, you see from this discussion that it's correct to feed meat to a dog. We see that the dogs eat meat. Rav Mari says, how much should you give him? You should give him not more than the size of his own ear, and then you should hit him with a stick. Otherwise, they'll keep coming back and bothering you. So have Rachmanas on and give him some food, and then make sure he never comes back. The Mari says that's only in the wilderness, but in the city, don't give him anything at all, because he'll never leave you alone within the city. Okay, says Rav Papa, there is no creature as poor as a dog, and there is no creature as rich as a pig who has plenty of food all over the place. Okay, now we go back to the discussion of what is hamra'ah and what is hal'ata. And the Gemara says we have a brayso that says explicitly, like Rav Yehuda, that the difference between the two is how far you push the food. The brayso says as follows: what is hamra'ah? Hamra'ah is you take the animal, you lie it on the ground, you force its mouth open and hold it open with a device, and you force in lentils and water together so that they should go deep down. What is hal'ata? That's hamra'ah. What's hal'ata? Hal'ata is that you feed it while it's still standing, and you put in the lentils one time and the water separately. It doesn't go that far down, and therefore it's not considered to be force feeding so far. Okay, that's like Yehuda said that the difference is how far the food goes. Okay, now the Gemara begins a sugya about Lush, mixing water and flour, which we'd seen at the end of the Mishnah, but it's a lengthy sugya which gets into the next daf deeply, so we will save it for daf.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.